Hi, everyone. Welcome to live stream with me, Dr. Aparajita Jitagunta. Uh, I am a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant, strategist, advisor, however you want to call it. And I'm also somebody who helps ambitious working women become better seen, heard, valued, respected, and recognized as visible leaders. So all of the work that I do is in diversity, equity, and inclusion. So thank you for tuning in to this live stream today. Because all of the work that I do is in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and given what is going on in our country right now with civil unrest and protests for equity and justice, justice for George Floyd, for Tony McDade, for Breonna Taylor, and for a countless number of Black Americans who have lost their lives, and for greater societal injustices and inequities, all the protests going on about that, I felt like this is a great time to talk about this idea of, can we actually include everyone? Is real equity across the board and justice across the board even possible? Or are those of us who are doing the work toward it, toward supporting movements towards equity and justice, are we just being delusional in thinking that everybody can be included? That's what I want to talk about today. And, just as a context before we get into this topic, I actually wrote about it on April 1st of 2019, which also, ironically, is the day that I set up AJ Rao LLC as everybody has come to know it over the past year and a half. Before that, I was in different forms. But this current form of the work that I do all started with this exact topic that we're talking about today. Can we include, everyone? And my response to that is yes, because inclusion, as I've said many times before, inclusion is not a zero-sum game. That being said, our current society is also not built to automatically think in that way. And I say that inclusion is not a zero-sum game because if you actually think about including people, for instance, let's take the social, the protests that are happening right now amidst all of the physical isolation, the stay-at-home measures, a lot of which are opening up, but a lot of which are still in place. In the midst of this overall context, what we are understanding is that this global health and economic crisis and these protests towards equity and justice are related, because it's not just about murders, or it's not just about police brutality, right? It's also about not having equal access to healthcare. It's about the disproportionate number of African Americans who who were infected with COVID and who died from the coronavirus, and not just the coronavirus, right? We're talking about health outcomes across the board, whether we are looking at this global health crisis or whether we are looking at the mortality of new Black mothers and new Black children, the postpartum prognoses, and even the prenatal care or the perinatal care for Black mothers. We're talking about the lack of, equitable access to proper resources in education systems in underserved communities, many of which are African Americans. So all of these factors are interrelated, right? They are not completely separate from each other. So just as this fight for and these protests and these movements towards equity and justice are so nuanced and are so interrelated, the inclusion of everybody in society is just as interrelated. Hey, Kristen, thank you so much for joining. Kimberly Crenshaw came up with this in the 1970s when she talked about intersectionalities, right? And so when we talk about can we include everyone, and when I say inclusion is not a zero-sum game, and that yes, we can include everybody, it is really by embracing our intersectionalities. For instance, one of my friends, Dr. Nicole Carter, made a very good point that, you know, everybody is talking about George Floyd and Philando Castile and Trayvon Martin, and yes, those names should be remembered, but what happened to Breonna Taylor? Why is there not the same uproar about Breonna Taylor as a Black woman? You know, because when we talk about Black Lives Matter, we have to include Black women's lives mattering in there. We have to include Black transgender individuals, their lives mattering. We also have to include, you know, every single person in the community who may be suffering or managing visible or invisible conditions of any kind, to where they are not getting equitable access to the resources that they need. And because of that, their quality of their life is compromised in many ways, right? So when we talk about inclusion, we're actually talking about the intersectionalities of all of these subgroups who also have to be included. So when we look at the whole person for their wholeness and understand their needs, and understand that their needs are different from ours, and understand their needs from their perspective. When we treat somebody not how we expect to be treated, but when we treat somebody in ways that they ask us to treat them, in ways that they ask us to help them, in ways that they ask us to support them. Inclusion is not delusional rather at all. Inclusion is almost inevitable. But in order to do that, we have to have an inclusive mindset. Everybody across the board has to have an inclusive mindset and has to realize that this need for equity and justice is innate in human beings, and that historically, yes, historically, inclusion was a zero-sum game. Our society was created only to benefit a few and not everybody. But that absolutely does not mean that we can't unlearn that outdated script and move forward by making things equitable. Now, what all of that entails across society is far more than the capability of any live stream or any episode or any single person out there. You know, obviously this requires a collective effort in the planning, in the thought process, in the implementation, in the execution, and in the maintenance and enforcement of all of this. It has to be a collective effort. But when every individual in that collective effort is represented as a whole person, then yes, we are going to have inclusion. And the other point there is, you know, we have to include all parts of diversity, right? A lot of this is something I see in corporate America a lot, and I don't mean to keep, you know, picking on corporate America. That's not what I'm trying to do. It's just that most of my examples, because I observe the trends in corporate America so much, most of my examples just happen to be from there rather than like pop culture shows or, you know, any other types of situations. So sorry, corporate America, not picking on you, but thank you for giving me this example. Corporate America has this great new movement where you know, many companies are saying they're focused on diversity of thought and perspective, which is great. It's absolutely great, you know, but it also makes me chuckle because in saying that they're including diverse thought and perspective, they're actually not including too much diversity at all. These people with diverse thoughts and perspectives have nuances of the same experiences. Their lived experiences don't end up being so different because they generally come from the same networks. They generally come from the same social classes. They generally come from the same cultures and ethnic backgrounds. Other than those few people who are elevated as tokens. Like we have the one woman on our team, or we have the one Black gentleman on our team, or we have the one African American lady on our team. Great. Those are tokens. That's not including everybody. That's including one perspective. But when we start including more people who look differently than us, who have completely different intersectionalities than us, who not just think differently, but have had lived experiences that are completely different in different parts of the country, who, again, not just think diversely, but also come from diverse cultures and diverse backgrounds and diverse genders and diverse sexual orientations. This diversity already exists. How can we bring the spectrum of this diversity and include it in our leadership? When we do that, when we can model proper representation across all demographics, no matter how politically incorrect or, like taking aside all of the political correctness, incorrectness, compliance, all of that from a human level, to realize that, yes, we can include everybody. We're not being delusional. And it is by embracing people for their wholeness and for their differences and appreciating them for having different lived experiences, because now they can teach you something as they learn something. So that kind of intersectional, intentional inclusion of intersectionalities, that's what's missing to me in some movements towards equity and justice. But that's also what's missing for me in the examples that I see, again, in corporate America. Not meaning to pick on corporate America, but this is how we can include everybody. Because again, inclusion is not a power, a zero sum kind of a power game. Inclusion is not about conforming people to a certain type of leadership or a certain type of a box. When we allow people to converge and align with their uniquenesses, our table for inclusion gets much larger. Our overall word cloud, of the diversity that we bring in gets much larger, and our inclusion gets much more tangible, and its impact gets amplified. Because the more diversity we have in our inclusion efforts intentionally, the more we realize that we're not being delusional. We should have done this like 20 years ago, So in that sense, moving towards full inclusion, moving towards this equity and justice, if you are a company that wants to do that, please, this is the exact time for you to get intentional about your inclusion. As I was saying in my live stream yesterday, what are the wellness programs that you have created for African American employees right now, for your Black, Indigenous, people of color community employees right now? What are the resources that your ERG and BRG leaders are getting to cater to their employees right now? How are they being compensated for this emotional labor? How are you reaching out to people for your hiring practices, for your promotions, for your raises? How are you supporting movements in society towards justice and equity? Are you actually just putting out statements, or are you investing in people who can give you who can give you culturally competent solutions, right? Because cultural competence, that's what we're going for here. And no matter how much intercultural communications trainings you do, no matter how much diversity and inclusion trainings you put your employees through, no matter how much harassment, like sexual harassment trainings and all of that you put your employees through, if you don't have holistic programs for wellness that empower your employees to thrive and to be mentally well because of their unique lived experiences, not just in your 9 to 5 compliant environment, but in all of their days, in all of their lives, then you are not intentionally including. You're missing the point. These are just a few things that you can do. And like I was saying yesterday, there's experts who do this work who are Black, Indigenous, or members of Black, Indigenous, or people of color communities. Use them. If you're worried about saying or doing the wrong thing, listen to the leaders in these communities. Listen to people in these communities having culturally sensitive and culturally competent conversations. You don't have to go in there with solutions. You don't. At the same token, you shouldn't put the burden of coming up with solutions on other people, but that doesn't mean you have to go in there with solutions. When you go in there out of this sheer mindset of learning and developing yourself and seeing how you can help particular communities because of their unique needs, you are intentionally including. When you do that, make sure you are intentionally including all intersectionalities. Make sure that your programs are, again, holistic, not just compliant. And when that starts happening, again, inclusion is inevitable because you're intentional about it and you're focused about it and you're strategic about it. The solution through all of this, the solution past the coronavirus, the solution past this civil unrest, at the end of the day, people just want equity and justice. And this is not something that I even need to take away anybody else's voice to say, because this is my fight too. This is all of our fight, right? And that's the mindset that we all have to realize, is that we have to do the work on our own to unpack our internal biases so that we can intentionally include everybody. So that we realize that inclusion is not a zero-sum game, that really it's just cultural competence, being culturally sensitive and honoring the person because of their unique journey and not in spite of it. That's all that it takes, mindset wise. Now, the implementation of these solutions is collective effort. But if every single person can start with the mindset, then I don't see why we can't make progress towards unpacking our own biases and unpacking the biases that people as entire communities feel in society right now, right? We got to unlearn these outdated scripts, and that starts with our mindset. And then we can start having conversations, using the same language, being on the same page of the same story. And then we can start talking about long-term, sustainable solutions. Because there's no doubt about it that in order for these solutions to happen, we have to disrupt some parts of things that are not working for us. And then we can evolve, we can transcend, we can grow, we can work and act together on it. Whatever words you want to use there for implementation, it has to start with us unpacking our own biases. So if anybody thinks that including everybody is not possible, that including using the current example for Black Lives Matter, that including Sandra Bland and Breonna Taylor and all the other Black women who died at, who were, the hands of police brutality, law enforcement, whatever, again, labels that you want to put on it, including them is not separate. Including them as part of it, including Tony McDade as part of it, including Tamir Rice as part of it, including Trayvon Martin as part of it, including any number of untold, unreported deaths are also part of it. They're not separate. So it's only when we include everybody that we can include ourselves, that we are included. So do you want to be included? That's what it boils down to. And if you do want to be included, then what is the work that you need to do to unpack all of your biases so that we can move towards that? And that's not being delusional. Again, if we do this the right way, it's inevitable. And we are going to move toward a more stable society for the sake of, well, our sakes and for the sake of our kids. The question is, are we willing to do what it takes, really? Society, communities, and corporate America, all made up of individuals coming together for this common purpose. Are we willing to do the work? I am. And I'd love it if people join me so that we can move towards equity, justice, and belongingness. That's about it for me for today. If you've joined in later, I hope you enjoyed this video. I am on Facebook and YouTube. Please don't forget to subscribe, and you can find my blog piece and more of my work on my website at www.ajrao.com. And I will be back on Thursday with another live stream. Bye.